let's get started.
Like,
First, so we're going to discuss Miss Shanquella Robinson. As many of you guys know, she went on vacation with some acquaintances, and they unalived her. And now her family is in the process of seeking justice for her. And the individual to your left of your screen is Daejhanea Jackson, and allegedly she is the individual that is on camera brutally attacking Miss Shanquella Robinson. The individual to your right is a Mexican journalist, I believe. I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I'm not going to try it and butcher it. And he's the person that has been in the forefront with a site called Metropolitics, if I'm not mistaken. And that's where a lot of people have been getting their news from. All right, let's get started with this. The procedure for extradition, if an extradition treaty exists. Let's keep in mind, everyone, that Mexico and the United States does have an extradition treaty that was signed, I believe, in 1978. So the procedures would go a receipt for an extradition request, a magistral inquiry, issue for an arrest warrant, procedure before a magistrate, and then surrender of a fugitive offender. What we just read there was the process. Let's take a look at this law firm. This firm specializes in extradition and international extradition. And they have a quick little rundown of how it works. I'm going to scroll on down because this is where we need to be. The process, if a foreign nation is seeking to extradite a fugitive from the U.S. Foreign nation, Mexico. The fugitive, allegedly, Daejhanea Jackson. I'm only saying that because that is the individual that is on camera assaulting Miss Shanquella Robinson. The process differs when a foreign nation is seeking to extradite a fugitive from the United States. Make sure I'm looking at the right thing. Domestically, the process begins when the Department of State, the DOS, Department of State, receives a request for extradition from the foreign nation, typically through the nation's embassy in Washington, D.C. Let's remember to keep that in mind. This request may or may not be accompanied by a request for a provisional arrest. Something else to note, it may or may not be accompanied by a request for a provisional arrest. If a provisional arrest is sought, the Department of Justice must obtain an arrest warrant in order to take the fugitive into federal custody. There is nobody being detained. There has to be an arrest warrant issued by the Department of Justice must obtain a warrant. Nobody's just being detained. So let's put that out there. Nobody's being detained, ladies and gentlemen. If somebody's in custody, there was an arrest warrant. Upon receiving a request for extradition, the Department of State will review the request to determine whether it satisfies all procedural requirements, whether the subject offense is an extraditable offense under the terms of the applicable treaty, and whether the extradition would raise any concerns with the foreign policy, or in regard to foreign policy. If the Department of State is satisfied with the request, it will then submit the request to the OAI. The OAI must then request a hearing in federal district court. And it is this hearing that a determination will be made with regard to extraditability. Sorry, this is such like a extraditability. Extradition hearings are not criminal trials. Let me repeat that again. Extradition hearings are not criminal trials. And as a result, the standard of proof is not beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, the judge must be convinced that the evidence sufficient to sustain the charge under the provisions of the proper treaty or convention or under Section 3181B. If the burden of proof is met, then the fugitive will be held in federal custody. If the burden of proof is met, the fugitive will be held in federal custody until the nation that requested extradition presents a valid warrant for the fugitive's surrender according to the relevant treaty provisions. My apologies. Now, they're saying that if the burden of proof is met, the fugitive will be held in federal custody until, that's where people are assuming that they're being detained. They're not necessarily being detained until the valid warrant for the fugitive surrender is presented, if that makes any sense, right? It's a bit confusing. You have a situation where they could have a provisional arrest request made, which in the case of Mexico, they've already said that they've issued an arrest warrant. What we don't know is whether they have presented the Department of State with a valid extradition request. We don't know that yet. And I think that's kind of the first thing everybody should be asking, because nothing else applies. Nothing is kickstarted until that official request is submitted to the Department of State. Then it kickstarts everything that else is going on. Now, there could be a point where people are saying, oh, the individuals are being detained, and it may seem that way. But for that to have happened, if you take a look here, a magistrate hearing would have been conducted. And if a magistrate hearing is already being conducted, that means interested parties, the next of kin, have been notified. Even though it's not a criminal trial, her parents are still interested parties. So they have to have been notified. And if the parents are saying they haven't been notified of anything, then I'd be a bit wary of saying, okay, this is what's going on. I think there's a bit of overlap and a bit of confusion because it's two different languages and two different legal systems. But whatever's going on in Mexico is going on in Mexico. But to kickstart something here in the United States, the extradition process can only be kickstarted, can only start going, the ball rolling, when the foreign nation, the foreign country, the foreign entity submits an official request to the State Department for extradition. I keep going over that, harping over that, because I feel like everybody's talking about there's arrest warrant. Yes, Mexico has issued an arrest warrant. Has anybody asked anyone if Mexico has submitted an official extradition request? Because that's the process that would happen here. It has nothing to do with Interpol. It has nothing to do with any of these other things. Interpol may come in if the Cabo 6 had left the United States. But we all know that they're here, they hadn't left, and the FBI's probably got an eye on them, right? Their passports allegedly were suspended. So I think there's just a bit of like wires crossing and things like that. Due to the nature of the U.S. extradition proceedings, fugitives who are deemed subject to extradition do not have a direct right of appeal. Instead, their only means of seeking relief is to file a petition of writ of habeas corpus, which, if successful, will have essentially the same effects of an appeal. All right, so let's get back to this part here. The receipt of the extradition request, the magistratal inquiry, the issue of an arrest warrant, procedure before the magistrate, then you're going to surrender the fugitive offender. Now, before we go into surrendering the fugitive offender, let's talk about what your defenses could be in the extradition proceeding. What are some of the defense strategies for fighting extradition to or from the United States? When fighting extradition, the defenses that are available are also determined by the relevant treaty and the governing body of law. Now, keep in mind, the U.S. and Mexico, like I said earlier, they already have a treaty that was signed in 1978. For example, fugitives who are facing extradition from the United States are entitled to due process and the other protections afforded by the US Constitution. That's why I keep insisting and saying, hey, they're just not detaining someone just for the sake of detaining someone. If somebody's in federal custody, warrants were issued. They're afforded the same due process. Now, is it all of the same due process? No, because you are a fugitive, but you are afforded some of the same rights. However, these protections may not be available in extradition proceedings conducted abroad. With this in mind, some examples of these type of defenses that may be available in the U.S. and foreign extradition process. All right, let's go. Lack of evidence. If the evidence that is available is insufficient to meet the burden of proof for establishing extraditability, then the extradition is appropriate. I'm going to get that word down. You guys, there's plenty of evidence here. There's a whole video. So that's not going to work. Statute of limitations. Similar to domestic prosecutions targeting individuals who are on U.S. soil, if the statute of limitations for subject offense has expired, then extradition isn't warranted. That's not going to work here for obvious reasons. The crime occurred not too long ago, and even if it was on U.S. soil, the statute of limitations would still be viable. Double jeopardy. Having already faced prosecution for the subject offense in one country may establish protection against double jeopardy under the terms of the applicable extradition treaty. That's not going to work here as well for obvious reasons. They fled Mexico. Dual criminality. Some extradition treaties incorporate the concept of dual criminality, which prohibits extradition when the act sought to be prosecuted is not a crime in the fugitive's current country of residence. Okay. That video was giving every bit of assault and several other things. So that's not going to work here. Nationality. Some countries will deny extradition of their own citizens, although many U.S. extradition treaties expressly prohibit foreign nations from providing special treatment on basis of their citizens. I don't think that's going to work here either. To be honest with you, I really think that they may end up having to go the humanitarian route, even though I think that's going to work as well, because there are plenty, and I mean plenty of Americans serving time in U.S. prisons. So let's take a look at earlier we discussed the process where it says it's get down here where it says surrender of a fugitive offender. Now, once it's gone through all the magistrate and everything else, the last and final hurdle the Cabo 6 will have will be the U.S. Department of State, specifically